Yeah, so I think that, like wokeness is over is a little bit too glib. And the main reason why that's the case, I think, maybe is self-evident, which is basically the bureaucracies of corporate America and of the government and of nonprofits, foundations, NGOs, schools, universities, the media companies, the press, basically the big bureaucracies, what we refer to as sort of the managerial class that sort of
cathedral.
The cathedral, Curtis Yarvin's term, the cathedral, or James Burnham's term, the managerial class, the managers who sort of run everything. And by everything being like basically all of the large incumbent institutions, like basically the wokeness has become standard policy, right? And like every large organization in the country, like the mandate number one is be compliant. Right. Like whatever is required to be compliant is like holy, right? It's like the thing that cannot be, you must be compliant. Like you must check off all the compliance boxes. Like whether you win or not in the market is kind of optional, but you must be compliant. Yeah. Whether you actually teach students anything is optional, but you must be compliant. And so, wokeness has become part of the compliance regime. Also what they refer to wonderfully, these great Orwellian terms, the risk management regime. It's incredible. The trust and safety regime.
Yeah.
It's, just take all these words and reverse them. So, this stuff has gotten wired very deeply, and then it's been well documented at this point that the foundation for a lot of what we call wokeness is actually baked deeply into the law, right? And a whole bunch of people have done, Richard Hanania and Jeannie Sutton, great writer, and Christopher Caldwell and Wesley Yang have all done great work in kind of documenting kind of how deep this stuff is sort of embedded in the law, which is a whole other topic. And so there's an institutionalization that's taken place that's going to take, optimistically 30 years to get out or something like that. And by the way, maybe never. Having said that, there's that, but then there's what we've been dealing with for the last decade, which is beyond that, which is sort of the idea of wokeness being like the cultural vanguard.
Yeah.
And basically being the thing that's like the coolest, highest status, highest fashion thing you can possibly be. And the thing that you have to be if you want to aspire to rise in the hierarchy and rise among the managerial class and run things. And then if you want to get like really good press coverage and if you want people to think that you're a moral person. So kind of that whole thing. And then there's the power component of it. And this, I use the Tolkien metaphor here, the ring of power, which is the ability to call somebody a bad name under the wokeness regime and like instantly vaporize them and blow them out of their job and take their job. Like those second parts are like, I think, fading very fast. And in a lot of ways, it's sort of inevitable that would happen because it's just like in fashion, whatever is cool and trending now looks dated 5 or 10 years later. And you wonder how people possibly could have worn bell bottoms or whatever. Like, it's that kind of phenomenon. And so there's no question, like the election basically punched a giant hole in the side of that balloon and it's deflating incredibly quickly. And by the way, you see it in the reaction. You see it in the reaction to the election itself, which is there, this is like the polar opposite reaction to 2016, which is just like there's like a complete deflation taking place. And I think wokeness is losing altitude quickly. But let's come back to the legal part, because that's also, there's very interesting things that might happen there that we could also talk about.
Yeah. So say more. What do you have in mind?
Well, so if you wanted to pick like the most extreme possible like attorney to put in charge of the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department to sort of reverse DEI, it would be this lawyer named Harmeet Dillon, who's been a California lawyer who's been, the scourge of woke corporations for the last decade. As it happens, she has just been appointed to run the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. And for the people who don't track this, the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department is the federal government, basically prosecutorial arm that basically enforces basically wokeness. They're the ones that basically have made sure for the last decade that all these companies have all these crazy policies under penalty of being investigated, subpoenaed, ultimately prosecuted. And by the way, there have been lots of prosecutions, lots of court cases. The most famous case that the current head of the Civil Rights Division brought was the case against SpaceX for not hiring enough refugees. Right. Notwithstanding that SpaceX is a military contractor and is not permitted to hire non-American citizens under a separate law. And so the person running that has been a true activist, as you'd expect from this last administration. Yeah. And then Ms. Dillon, who, by the way, I don't know, but I've been following for years and is clearly brilliant. She's the exact opposite of that. And so every sort of signal is, I don't want to speak for this new administration, but every signal is being sent that they're going to basically do a 180 on all these things. And they are going to begin prosecuting companies for violations of civil rights laws in the form of reverse discrimination, which is to say discrimination against variously white people, Asians, Jews, and many other, the unprotected classes, as they say. Right. And so signals are being sent by the appointments that there is going to be an assault that's going to be the reverse of the assault that companies have been under and universities have been under. And then, of course, the Supreme Court, ruled not that long ago that private universities are not allowed to do race-based admissions. And it's actually really funny because there's some question as to whether the demographic shift of admissions in the last year was starkly different than the year before as these institutions claim that they're coming into the compliance with the Supreme Court. There's some question as to whether discovery would show that they're actually in compliance or whether they're still playing games. So That's another thing we may find out here. And then there's a very open question as to basically whether essentially de facto that decision already has been made or will be made for private companies as well. And there's a lot of private companies that have been trying to figure out quietly how to kind of dismount from DEI for actually both reasons, for legal reasons and for cultural reasons. And now there's another sort of very interesting thing that's kicking in, which is there, I think, are a lot of large companies where basically they were already basically done with DEI to start. They were done with DEI for their own reasons, which is, it's backfired in many spectacular ways. But now they have any large company that wants to dismount from it now has the best reason in the world, which is we need to be compliant. We right?
Because it's illegal. Yeah.
Because it's illegal. And by the way, let me just state for the record, I think every major corporation in the country is just in flagrant violation of actual written civil rights law. You cannot have these hard quotas and basically all these racially and ethnically and religiously biased, hiring. Right. It's just flat out illegal. And these companies basically all went so extreme on this that they ended up in what I think is clearly mass illegality. And so as Ms. Dillon kind of kicks in her job, let's say she's not going to lack for a shortage of targets. And so if you don't want to be a target, it is a great kind of, get out of jail free card to just voluntarily shut all this stuff down. And my guess is starting pretty quickly here. I mean, we're already starting to see it, right? So Boeing and a bunch of other, companies have already put a bullet in their programs. And even the University of Michigan, which kind of went completely bananas for this stuff, actually shut their whole thing down. So I think we're going to see my guess is we're going to see a run of companies that are going to take, quite dramatic action here. So you have basically these sort of elites that we're talking about, this managerial class, the sort of, people who have been in power for the last 4 years in particular, people who have been running large institutions. They got used to being on the side of censorship, and they got used to wielding censorship as a tool against their enemies in the form of these sort of things like, again, Orwellian things, hate speech, misinformation, so forth. There's a big obvious problem with censorship, which is it's a violation of literally the American way of life. It's a violation of the principles of Western civilization, of everything that makes our society great. This idea you're going to basically prevent other people from speaking. So there's that. But I think there's actually another problem with it, which is it actually causes you, the way I describe it is it causes you to mount a denial service attack on your own epistemic ability to understand reality. Right? If in other words, basically, if you have the ring of power that basically says you can define anything contrary to your current beliefs as hate speech and misinformation, then you will never receive valid counterarguments to your own views. Yeah. And then sort of that's the sort of intellectual equivalent of taking a hose, hooking it up to the exhaust pipe of your car and jamming the other end straight into your mouth, right? Which is just you're just going to breathe your own exhaust forever. And if you're only breathing your own exhaust, if you're only believing yourself, right, and people who are like you, and you're never listening to contrary information, right, because it's hate speech or misinformation, and it's been censored, then there is no limit to how crazy you can get because there's no governor, right? You are not required to stay in contact with reality. And so I think the censorship basically regime worked for these people for quite a while. And then starting probably, 3 or 4 years ago, it actually stopped working. And it's led them into a set of policies that are just bananas. And so a big thing that I think that they really have to do is rip off the Band-Aid and stop with all that and get back to being, get back to being able to mark your beliefs to market, right? To reality, just like every business person has to.